Hi, I'm Candace Felice. In this Community Life in Northeast Georgia featured podcast, did you know that not all honey is equal in quality and nutrients? Today, we take a trip to Blue Ridge Honey Company and speak with owners Bob and Suzette Benny, who have spent most of their lives in the bee and honey business. We're on location at Blue Ridge Honey Company, located in Lakemont, Georgia, right off of US 441. And we're speaking with the owners, Suzette and Bob Benny. Thank you both for coming on the program today.
Oh, well, thank you for coming.
What's different about your company than the other honey distributors in Northeast Georgia?
We are the largest honey distributor in Northeast Georgia, probably the largest north of Tifton, Georgia. We run about 2,500 colonies, which is fairly substantial size for this area. So not only are we the largest honey packer, but also the largest beekeepers in this part of the state, and actually in this region, including western North Carolina and upstate South Carolina and all. We started in Oregon in 1981, got a job for a commercial beekeeper there. And in the West, we concentrated on pollination mostly, whereas here we concentrate on producing honey, packing honey, and producing bees to sell to other beekeepers that are either starting up or have lost some of their own bees through the winter. Probably half our business has to do with beekeeping supplies and providing bees in the form of packages, or they call it nukes, which is short for nucleus. We sell a lot of that in the spring and midsummer, and this coming summer we're also going to be selling a lot of queens. There aren't any large queen producers in this part of the state. Almost all of them are in South Georgia or North Florida or farther south, so that'll be unique. You mentioned Carl and Virginia Webb. They produce queens, just on a little smaller scale is all.
I know there is a difference between the species of bees that are in this area. What type of species do you use?
Well, it can be tricky when you say species. They're all actually come from the same thing in the beginning, Apis mellifera, and then there's Apis mellifera carnica, and I'll get down to English language instead of Latin. There's Italian bees and carniolan bees that come from areas like the Slovenia and Austria and Germany. And then there's Caucasian bees, which come from the Caucasus Mountains. Really, they're all the same basic species. They've just evolved over, the last few centuries in their own way. We use carniolan bees. They're darker bees, and they're more winter hardy than the Italian bees. The most common bee in this country is the Italian bee. That's the golden yellow bees that some people like so much because the queens are easy to find. They are gentle, they don't swarm badly, and they're good honey producers. But they are a little more susceptible to diseases and viruses, so that's why we lean towards the carniolan, and that's why some people lean towards the Russian too. They're more mite resistant and disease resistant than the Italians.
And explain to our listeners the different flavorings. Does that come from the plant itself, or do you put that into the honey when you're making it?
Yeah, we don't use the word flavoring because that makes people think we've added something to it. Many people are surprised to find out that honey is not honey is not honey. I think it's all the same thing. You're right, there are a lot of different flavors and tastes, and that has to do with the chemistry of the nectar of the flower. It would have a different mineral content, different sugar chemistry. What gives honey its color is the mineral content. That's why it's believed by health food experts that darker honey is better for you because it has a higher mineral content. And that strictly has to do with the nectar, of the flower that's being collected by the bees. There's a lot of unique enzymes in honey, but what a lot of people don't know is that most of those enzymes are added by the bees out of their own system to help stabilize the nectar into honey. It inverts some of the sugars and changes the chemistry of the honey to suit the bees better for storage.
So, Bob, you basically produce honey year-round. There is no downtime for your honey production.
Well, we don't produce honey all year long, but we pack honey all year long. Okay. The production time frame for us probably ranges from early April till early August. Any honey that the bees make from early August on, which isn't very much, we leave it for them for the winter. Bees use a lot of food in the wintertime. We like to leave them with 60 to 100 pounds of honey to make it through the winter. And then another byproduct of the colony of bees is pollen. That's their protein source, and a good healthy colony will use at least 100, maybe 120 pounds of pollen a year. Many people find that quite surprising. Pollen is the male part of the flower. The bees collect it on purpose and also inadvertently. When they dive into a flower to collect nectar, quite often they get covered in pollen, and then as they go to the next flower, without even trying, they're actually pollinating the next flower from just what's covered on their body.
So what are some of the other medicinal purposes of honey? I know it's better for you than actually using sugar that's been refined.
Well, even though it is mainly sugar, good honey usually ranges from 17 to 18% water, and the rest is solids. The largest portion of those solids, of course, is sugars. It's not just sucrose. The major sugars in honey will be sucrose, fructose, maltose, and glucose. And the way it's set up in honey, it enters the system much slower. You don't get a sugar rush. And that's why some athletes these days are using it for the slow energy they can get out of honey, unlike sugar, which just kind of gives you a big blast and then it's gone. In raw honey, you have pollen particles, propolis particles, and beeswax particles floating in the honey. Raw honey is very good for you in that respect. A lot of people think that local honey is good for their allergies, and that's true, but they've done some recent studies in Great Britain and found that what's more important than local honey that may or may not have been pasteurized and microfiltered is this raw honey thing. They found that the peculiar enzymes that are in honey were doing more for allergies than actually the local pollens that were found in raw honey. Of course, if you get both raw local honey, you're getting the best of both worlds, but many people are surprised to find out it's the enzymes that are doing more work for your allergies than it is the actual local pollen.
Bob, when someone finds bees on their property and they've made a hive, are those bees the same type of bees that produce the honey that you're speaking of?
Well, basically they are, yeah. There's no such thing as a domesticated bee. Even the bees we keep are essentially wild bees. We just try to manage them as best we can and trick them into doing what we want them to do. Bees are hoarders by nature, and that's actually, I might be wrong, but I believe that they're the only insect that collects food that we can harvest, as human beings. And giving enough opportunity and enough space to store it, they will store way beyond their own needs. And that's where we come in and we're able to harvest, the extra. We call it the surplus honey that the bees don't need, we can collect. So, but back to your original question, they are essentially the same bee. Might be a little bit of a different genetic makeup, as there is through all bees in the country. There aren't any native honeybees in America. They all came from Europe originally, starting in the 1600s actually. They can see on some of the manifests for some of the ships that came over, they came over in barrels and all kinds of ways that they could keep them. And then in the 1700s it really picked up. The first bees we believe that came over came from Germany, and the Italian bees that are so popular actually didn't start to show up till the late 1800s. And in 1922, I believe, they actually banned importation of honeybees from other countries into the United States. So since that time, we've been kind of working with what we already had. Just recently, they're allowing germoplasm, if I'm saying that right, or sperm, essentially, to come into this country from other countries after it goes through a quarantine. So we're able to add to our genetic pool here in this country by doing that, but it's still not allowed to bring other bees into this country from many countries. They loosened up bees coming from Australia and New Zealand a few years back to help pollinate on the west coast, but I'm not even sure those bees are allowed anymore. They found out that the genetics were not desirable, and even if they are still allowed, a lot of people have quit bringing them in.
As a business, you mentioned as we began our conversation about how you and Suzette began in Oregon. Do you find it's easier to work with bees?
Well, it's actually probably harder to work with bees. Not everybody wants to take the stings that we do. Most people that work with bees have a strong interest in them in the first place. Just getting a job for a beekeeper as a laborer is no fun at all unless you have interest in the bees themselves. We do work quite hard in the summertime. It's quite hot You can imagine putting on a bee suit or a jacket and a veil, and some people choose to use gloves. We don't use gloves very much because they're just too hot. Makes it hard to work. So you get stung a lot, and some people just can't put up with that. You do build somewhat of an immunity to it. It doesn't mean you don't feel the pain when they sting you, but you don't swell up as badly as someone who's not used to getting stung daily. Some days we can get stung quite a bit. A good day might only be 10 stings. A bad day could be 200. We get stung a lot.
So you can't be allergic to bees.
Cannot be allergic to bees and do this job.
Yeah.
You cannot. It's an impossibility. Yeah.
Well, I thought that the smoke that comes from the little canisters that you also sell here helped calm the bees down so that they wouldn't sting you.
Well, it helps a lot, actually. And really, if you think about it, there's not a living thing on the planet that doesn't cower to smoke. Mm-hmm. It's more about backing them up, and you mask their alarm pheromones, and I'm not sure it actually calms them. When the bees sense that there's smoke in their environment, a lot of times they'll fill their bellies with honey instinctively in a possible preparation for leaving their cavity in case their own home catches on fire, and that can help some. It helps calm the bees a little bit, but mainly you're masking their pheromones and that they communicate with. If one bee puts off an alarm scent, the other bees pick up on that, and pretty soon the whole colony can be on high alert and ready to sting. So the smoke just kind of backs them up, masks the pheromones, just kind of makes them cower a little bit. I don't know if that's the right word, but it doesn't really calm them in itself.
Suzette, tell us about this beautiful retail facility that you have here at the front of your building.
Our retail store actually opened 2 years ago next week. Up until then, we were just wholesaling out of a different location and doing online internet sales. Our retail store is open Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 5, and on Saturdays, 9:30 to 5. And we have lots of varieties of honey. We also have honey tasting here, so if you're curious about anything or just can't decide what type of honey you like, you can come in and taste the honey. We have lots of beekeeping supplies here for beekeepers, anything that you would possibly need for beekeeping. We have an educational area also, observation hive. You can also look into our observation windows, into our bottling room, and see the process there. And during the season when we're extracting honey, you can also look into the extracting room and watch that process happen. We have lots of gift items, and we use our beeswax right here in our candle making station, which is available for people to see. It's right behind the counter, and we sell lots of pure beeswax candles here. Also, we offer classes, and we also have all the candle making supplies and molds that you would need to do that.
Suzette, do you also offer field trips for our local schools in the area?
Yes, we do. We've had schools come from Gainesville. A lot of the local bee clubs will plan a field trip here also. And so, anybody that wants to take a tour, if you're just popping in and you want to see around, there's usually somebody here that can do that for you and answer your questions.
Now, you are a retail and a wholesaler, so do you sell to any local grocery stores where our listeners could also purchase your honey?
Yes, locally here in Rabun County, we are in Andy's Market, Walmart, Osage Farms. Further south, we're in Habersham, Jamar Farms.
Blue Creek Cafe in Hollywood, and then almost all the Krogers in the state of Georgia.
Yes.
And most of the Walmarts that are in the North Atlanta area.
Well, Bob, why don't we take a tour of the facility and explain to our listeners this big operation you have going on in this beautiful blue, I would call it robin's egg colored building.
Right now the honey that's being bottled is, I think, going to Costco under another label. We do co-pack for other beekeepers and other honey companies. We bottled a lot of honey last year. It was over 1 million pounds, so it was a fair amount. We bottle it as raw honey. We do not heat it to a high temperature, nor do we microfilter it. So the enzymes and the yeast are intact, and the small particles of, say, pollen, beeswax, and propolis are, still in there. So it's pretty much a raw product. We have 3 girls that work every day bottling honey. I only see 1 or 2 in there right now, but sometimes that's a pretty busy place in there. And this room over here, this window is where you can see the extracting during the season when we're actually extracting honey. You can see the extracting machine right there.
Is that the thing that looks like a vent?
Yeah, there's a basket in there that spins, and when you put the comb in there that's already been on-capped at the other end of the conveyor, it spins. You shut the hood, of course, so stuff doesn't fly all over the room.
Okay.
And it spins the combs around, and the centrifugal force throws the honey out of the comb, and it goes down into the bottom of the tank and flows into another tank where it's pumped up into these drums over here, or tanks. We just got through processing honey about 2, maybe 3 weeks ago. The last crop of the year that we processed this year was cotton honey, cotton blossom honey from middle Georgia. In the spring we make things like black locust and black gum and blackberry and tulip poplar, and then in the late spring you'll see things like privet and persimmon and sumac, and then by around the 1st of July we're moving into the sourwood season, which is a biggie for us. Sourwood in this area is considered a Cadillac honey. It's only produced in quantities in the southern Appalachians, so there's a supply and demand issue there, and it's kind of pushed the price up, in some cases, twice as much as normal honey, and that's part of why we ended up being business right here. The first year we had bees on a smaller scale. We did really well on sourwood, and it helped finance our expansion in the early years. We had a few good crops, and it really made a difference.
So these metal canisters that we see here, there's a smaller one and then there's a larger one. Are they different, or they're just according to how big you want to produce?
Well, they do the same thing, but the smaller one holds 2 frames and the bigger one holds 36. Of course, this is part of our supply business. We don't use these smaller units like this. It's just the units that we sell here. Well, those are storage tanks that people can purchase. So you see right now I see 5 different versions of extractors, with that one there being the least expensive and this being the most expensive. This one right here would be for somebody that had a few hundred colonies. These smaller ones might be for somebody that had a few, maybe ranging to 20 or 50.
So these metal slats, you put the honeycomb on there and the centrifugal force is what's forcing it out?
That's correct. If you were to look at a comb from an end view and slice it so you could actually see into the comb, you would see that the cells on both sides of the frame are pointed upwards in a 15-degree angle. So when you stack them into this machine, you stack the tops of the combs towards the outside, and as it spins, it throws the honey out of that 15-degree angled cell towards the face of the tank, and then it just drains to the bottom and flows out that spigot right there. The bees are really amazing. They've made the most efficient pattern possible in nature in a honeycomb to hold the honey in place. The cells there's no space wasted, and plus that 15-degree angle helps hold the honey in there. And then honey comes in very thin. It comes in usually over 50% water. In some cases it can be 70 or 80% water. And once the bees work the moisture out of it, they'll cap it over with beeswax. And it's up to the beekeeper to uncap the comb with a hot knife, or in our case we have vibrating knives with our automated equipment. Takes the cappings off of the comb so that when you put it in the extractor like this one, it'll come out. You have to get those cappings off first.
It smells so good. Is there a particular wood that you're using?
We have 3 different types of wood in here. Some of the stuff is made out of cypress, some is made from southern yellow pine, and some is made from eastern white pine. So you're smelling 3 different kinds of wood.
Is that what I'm smelling?
Yeah, that candle burning in there really makes the place smell good.
Yeah.
Again, I don't smell it so much anymore, but people walk in and go, "Oh my, that was wonderful."
The paint that you have on it, is that like Kills? Is that a primer?
Well, actually we use a good oil-based primer on it, and then we put 2 coats of acrylic enamel.
Okay.
We've had the best luck. I've tried all kinds of paints, and we found that acrylic enamel for the cover coat gives us the best durability and longevity. And one of the keys, though, is having a good oil-based primer first. So oil-based primer is better than latex primer for our purposes.
And this is the products that you're selling on your commercial side for the other beekeepers
Correct,
in the area?
Yeah, all of this stuff is, and all this woodenware is for sale. And a lot of this is cypress. All of these drums have honey in them. All of the upstairs floor is covered in beekeeping equipment and containers. We go through a lot of containers. We actually sell a lot of containers too. Because of our volume, we're able to get a good enough price that we can resell them to other beekeepers and people in the area. We'll have people come from 100 miles around just to buy, honey-specific type containers. We use a lot of pints and quarts, but there's a lot of containers like the honey bears and skeps that are peculiar just for honey, and you can't get them anywhere else except for a container supply company that handles honey containers.
Wow. How do you keep this climate controlled in the summers?
Well, we don't worry about this part of the warehouse. We worry about the space we just came out of. We try to keep it very dry. We use air conditioning and dehumidifiers to keep the moisture down because honey is hygroscopic, which means it'll absorb moisture in a humid environment. Now out here, all of these drums are sealed, so it's not an issue. We don't like it to get real hot, and we don't like it to get real cold. And this building doesn't. It's a pretty well insulated building. As you can see, it's double insulated with the walls and all. And in the winter, it doesn't drop below about 55 or 60 degrees. And in the summer, it usually doesn't get over 90 in here.
You do your own packing here. So do you just take the barrels from here, or do you sell to other commercial industries so that they can bottle their own?
Well, both, actually. We have a lot of people that buy from us in barrels or buckets and bottle it themselves. And I'll show you something that's curious here. I can turn the light on if you actually want to look at this.
Oh, yes, most definitely. Wow, it's hot in here.
It's hot in here. We try to get the honey warmed up to 100 degrees so we can pump it. And we blend in here. See, all of these drums are something different. And we'll hook 3 or 4 hoses up and pump at the same time. And we can take 2 or 3 or 4 different types of honey and blend it into one mixture. And most of our honey gets sold like that as a blended wildflower. Try not to touch any of these drums, they'll be sticky. The room is heated from the floor. The heat is in the floor. You're standing on a very hot floor. You probably can't feel it through your shoes, but that's where the heat is coming from. These barrels were just put in here yesterday, and then tonight we'll pump them out into the tanks after the girls are done bottling.
Why are some
It's
have
just
coat?
beeswax and air bubbles and things like that. It's nothing bad. It's quite edible. In fact, I think the white stuff tastes better than the honey itself. That's just me personally. But it's just this foamy stuff. Pretty good, really. Yeah. That's good honey right there.
What kind is that?
This barrel actually came from Wisconsin. We send bees around the country, and we sometimes produce honey in other states and sometimes purchase honey in other states. In the last several years, we've had bees in California, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and South Dakota.
This is such an impressive business that you have here. How many people do you employ?
I think we have 18 right now, plus ourselves.
The two of us,
so I guess it's 20 people altogether. These fellows over here are beekeeping. They're loading a truck, getting ready for a trip down to South Georgia next week. They're loading supplies. Right now we have over half of our bees are in Unadilla and Pinehurst, Georgia. It's about 45 minutes south of Macon. We take them down there so they can overwinter better because it's warmer, and we can start making bees for sale a few weeks earlier than we can up here. So we have some trucks and forklifts that are off-road, and we move bees in the night, move them in the dark, and we do a lot of that at certain times of the year.
Is there any particular reason why you do it at night?
Yeah, they're blind as a bat in the dark. They can't see. So if you load them up after dark and get to wherever it is you're going before the sun comes up, no matter how excited or angry or whatever they are, they'll still be with the truck. If you do it in the daylight, you lose a good many of your bees because they just fly out of the boxes and don't know the truck's going down the road. They can't get back in, so you lose them.
Oh, that's so smart.
What we do, the bees can't see red, so our forklifts all have red lights on them so we can see what we're doing in the dark, but the bees don't come to the red lights. If you use white lights, the bees will all come to the white lights and you'll have a problem. So we use red lights at night to move bees.
Is it true or is it a fable that bears really like honey?
Honey's actually the secondary treat for them. It's like dessert. What they're really tuned into is the protein source in the larva inside a beehive. So I've actually seen combs where a bear had hit a beehive and he ate the center out where the larva was and left the honey behind. Now, don't get me wrong, they love honey, but it's the larva, that protein source, that is most attractive to them. They can smell it from a long ways away. Most of our yards have an electric fence around them, so the bears can't get in. We use a very hot charger. We do a very nice, strong fence. The inexpensive chargers that most people use for sheep and goats will not work with a bear. You have to use a very good charger. They're persistent. Yeah, they're tough.
We have black bears up here in the North Georgia mountains.
Oh, yeah, lots of them, more than people realize. You put out a few bee colonies and you'll find out real quick just how many there are. I think the most important thing that the bees do is pollination. Honey's great, all of this stuff is great that we sell, and even though we don't commercially pollinate as much as we used to, the lady right down the street that runs the deli has a house close to one of our bee yards, and she said since we moved our bees a half a mile from her, her garden is suddenly much, much better. Things you'll notice if you don't have ample pollination, you might have a crooked cucumber or watermelon that's not shaped right, or maybe simply just not as many watermelons or cucumbers. And people who have ample bee populations in their area will notice they have a much better garden. So the pollination is the big thing. It really is.
Scientists are alarmed at the reduction of bees. Why do you think that is?
Well, nobody can put their finger on one single thing. My personal theory is it's kind of like a perfect storm. Bee is kind of like a canary in the coal mine. The problem with the bees is that they're more susceptible to stuff than a canary is. Chemistry changes in the environment, pesticides and herbicides and things that are coming into the colonies inadvertently sometimes really alter the way the bees can, deal with their food and stuff. Fungicide, they're proving that fungicide is really bad for bees because it inhibits the bees' ability to ferment and digest their food. And then you add on to that the decreasing forage for bees. 100 years ago there was so many wildflowers, and now everything is nicely cultivated, and you have large monoculture fields, and there's just not as much forage for bees anymore. And then you add to that exotic viruses that come into the country. Just like we as humans get an exotic flu bug from time to time, stuff comes in for the bees too. They have to deal with that. And then the worst and above all is something called the varroa mite that's been in this country for 20, 30 years. And it's really hard for the bees to deal with that. It feeds on the bees and it feeds on the larvae, and that's the big thing that scientists are trying to deal with now, mainly with genetics, with the bees, trying to breed bees that are resistant to that. And they're making headway. It's happening. Now, this thing about the bees disappearing is a little bit false. The number of bees in the country right now is pretty stable. The reason is that commercial beekeepers, and even hobbyists too, are continually making more bees out of their own bee colonies. They'll split them and put a queen with a new colony and make another one, and that's how we're keeping the numbers up. So the numbers aren't really going down much. We lose a lot of bees every year, but we as humans and beekeepers are keeping the numbers up. So it's not quite as bad as people might think. It's a problem. I'm not telling you it's not. It is a problem, but we're kind of working on it and keeping up with it. And hopefully 50 years from now, this will just be something in the past that we talk about and not a reality.
Is there such a thing as a genetically modified bee, a super bee? It would have to be the queen, I would think.
Well, it would, and the drone, and the bees themselves too, but there's no such thing as a super bee, really. It's just like cows and dogs. I mean, they're breeding for traits. Right now, I just listened to a lecture from a fellow from Purdue University. They're trying to breed for a trait in some bees they found that have a grooming behavior, that they groom the mites off and chew their feet. Sounds real odd, but that's what they do. And then the Russian bees that Carl and Virginia Webb have, they have some traits that combat mites too. So not really a super bee, just traits that they're breeding for. And eventually I think they'll come up with what we need.
Well, we've had a wonderful tour and a wonderful visit with the two of you, and we've discussed the hard work and dedication it takes to be a beekeeper and to run this big enterprise, because you're more of a corporation than you are a small mom and pop operation. On the brighter side, what would you say, Suzette, is the biggest blessing that you've received from being in this business?
Well, we work for ourselves, and we have a lot of time together doing it. So I think that's the biggest, yes.
And how about you, Bob?
Independent. I like being independent. That's the big thing for me. And plus, oddly enough, beekeeping allows us to be creative. Being a beekeeper takes an inventive type of person and tenacious, and gives us the ability to create and be independent, and I really like that.
Bob and Suzette, thank you so much for allowing us to come in and learn about your business and learn about how you're giving back.
Thank you for coming anytime.
Yeah.
We hope you've enjoyed this Community Life in Northeast Georgia featured podcast brought to you by WPPR Demarest, a Georgia Public and NPR affiliate radio station from the Piedmont College Demarest campus in the Swanson Center complex on 88.3 FM. To contact us, email wppr@piedmont.edu. And if you'd like to know more about local life and events in Northeast Georgia, join in on the conversation at Facebook at WPPR Demarest. I'm Candace Felice.